Frank Thompson sat in his favorite wooden rocking chair on his front porch, watching the morning sun peek through the trees. At 93 years old, his body might have slowed down, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. His wrinkled hands, marked with age spots, gently rested on his walking cane, the same one he had been using for the past 15 years. Every morning, Frank followed the same routine he had kept since his wife Martha passed away 5 years ago. He would wake up at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., brush his teeth, put on his neatly pressed clothes, and make himself a simple breakfast of toast and coffee. His house, though old, was always clean and organized, just like he had learned in the military so many years ago. The neighborhood kids called him Grandpa Frank, and he didn't mind one bit. They would often stop by after school, sitting cross-legged on his porch while he told them stories about his time in World War II. Frank never talked about the scary parts. Instead, he shared stories about friendship, bravery, and how people from different countries helped each other during tough times. His garden was his pride and joy. Martha had started it, and after she passed away, Frank made sure to keep it beautiful in her memory. Red roses, yellow daffodils, and purple violets filled the small space with color. Every morning, he would spend an hour tending to the flowers, talking to them softly as if they could hear him. "Looking good today, ladies," he would say, carefully watering each plant. At 10 o'clock a.m., Frank would put on his old brown jacket, the one with his military medals pinned to the pocket, and begin his daily walk to Betty's diner. It wasn't a long walk, just 3 blocks, but it took him nearly 20 minutes with his slow, careful steps. He didn't mind. The walk gave him a chance to say hello to his neighbors and pet the friendly dogs along the way. Betty's diner had been there for as long as anyone could remember. The bell above the door would ring as Frank pushed it open, and Betty herself would call out, "Morning, Frank." The usual? She always had his favorite spot ready, the corner booth near the window where he could watch people pass by on the street. His breakfast order never changed: 2 scrambled eggs, whole wheat toast, and a fresh cup of coffee. The young waitress, Sarah, would always stop to chat with him while refilling his cup. She reminded him of his granddaughter who lived far away in California. Sarah would tell them about her college classes, and Frank would give her advice about life, drawing from his many years of experience. Some days, other veterans from the local VFW post would join Frank at his table. They were all younger than him. Most had served in Vietnam or Korea, but they treated him with special respect. They called him Sarge, even though he had been a technical sergeant, and they'd always listened carefully when he shared his wisdom. After finishing his meal, Frank would carefully count out the exact change plus a generous tip for Sarah. He believed in being fair and taking care of people who worked hard. The walk home was usually slower, as the sun would be higher and warmer by then. He would stop to rest on the bench in front of Mrs. Johnson's house, where her cat would often come to rub against his legs. Back home, Frank would spend his afternoons reading the newspaper from front to back, solving crossword puzzles to keep his mind sharp, and sometimes writing letters to his granddaughter. He had a computer that his son had given him, but Frank preferred paper and pen. "Some things are better the old-fashioned way," he would say with a smile. As evening approached, Frank would sit on his porch again, watching the neighborhood children play and ride their bikes. Parents felt better knowing Frank was there, like a guardian angel keeping an eye on their kids. He would wave to people passing by, and sometimes neighbors would bring him home-cooked meals or stop for a chat. Life was simple for Frank Thompson, but he liked it that way. After all the excitement and chaos he had seen in his younger years, peace and quiet were exactly what he wanted. Little did he know that his peaceful life was about to face an unexpected challenge. The first sign of trouble came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Frank was working in his garden when he heard it, the loud rumble of motorcycle engines, not just 1 or 2, but what sounded like a dozen of them. He stood up slowly, leaning on his garden tool for support, and watched as a group of bikers roared past his house. Later that evening, Frank learned from his neighbor Tom that an old warehouse 2 blocks away had been bought and turned into a biker bar called the Iron Horse. At first, Frank didn't think much of it. After all, he had learned in his long life that change was a natural part of any neighborhood. But within a week, things began to change drastically. The peaceful afternoon quiet that Frank had enjoyed for so many years was now regularly broken by the sound of revving engines. The bar opened at noon, but it got especially noisy after dark. Some nights, the sound of loud music and shouting would carry all the way to Frank's bedroom. The neighborhood children who used to play freely in the streets until sunset now had to go inside earlier. Their parents worried about the strangers who hung around the bar, many of whom didn't look friendly. Mrs. Johnson from across the street stopped letting her grandkids visit because of all the traffic from the motorcycles. One morning, as Frank made his usual walk to Betty's diner, he noticed empty beer bottles scattered on the sidewalk. This had never happened before. He carefully picked them up, not wanting any children to get hurt, and put them in a nearby trash can. His hands shook slightly, not from age, but from disappointment at seeing his beloved neighborhood changing. At Betty's diner, the conversation had changed too. Instead of the usual friendly chatter about family and local news, people now talked about the problems the bar was bringing. Sarah, the young waitress, told Frank she didn't feel safe walking home from her late shift anymore. Betty herself said her evening business had dropped because regular customers were scared to come out at night. Frank noticed other changes too. The small grocery store on the corner started closing earlier. The owner, Mr. Chen, said some bikers had been harassing his teenage daughter who helped at the store. The local park where Frank often sat to feed the birds was now often empty, except for groups of leather-clad men who would gather there, speaking loudly and leaving their trash behind. Even Frank's beloved garden started showing signs of trouble. One morning, he found motorcycle tire tracks across his lawn, barely missing Martha's prized rose bushes. Another day, he discovered cigarette butts thrown into his flower beds. Each time, Frank would quietly clean up the mess, but his heart grew heavier. The local police seemed overwhelmed. When neighbors called to complain about the noise or suspicious activities, they would come, but usually long after the trouble had passed. Officer Reynolds, who had known Frank for years, admitted they were short-staffed and couldn't be everywhere at once. The final straw came when Frank was sitting on his porch one afternoon. A group of bikers stopped their motorcycles right in front of his house. They were young men with leather jackets and tattoos covering their arms. One of them looked straight at Frank and revved his engine so loud it made the old veteran's windows rattle. Frank didn't move from his chair. He sat straight, just as he had been trained in the military, and looked back at them calmly. The biker seemed annoyed that Frank wasn't scared. He revved his engine again, even louder this time, and shouted something to his friends that made them all laugh. As they finally rode away, Frank remained in his chair, but his mind was already working. He remembered his old surgeon's words from the war. Sometimes the biggest battles start small, and are not always won with guns. Frank knew he needed to do something, not just for himself, but for his whole neighborhood. That night, as Frank lay in bed listening to the distant noise from the bar, he made a decision. He might be old, but he wasn't helpless. Tomorrow, he would start fighting back, not with violence, but with the same careful planning and strategy that had kept him alive during the war. The first sign of trouble came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Frank was working in his garden when he heard it. The loud rumble of motorcycle engines, not just one or two, but what sounded like a dozen of them. He stood up slowly, leaning on his garden tool for support, and watched as a group of bikers roared past his house. Later that evening, Frank learned from his neighbor Tom that an old warehouse 2 blocks away had been bought and turned into a biker bar called the Iron Horse. At first, Frank didn't think much of it. After all, he had learned in his long life that change was a natural part of any neighborhood. But within a week, things began to change drastically. The peaceful afternoon quiet that Frank had enjoyed for so many years was now regularly broken by the sound of revving engines. The bar opened at noon, but it got especially noisy after dark. Some nights, the sound of loud music and shouting would carry all the way to Frank's bedroom. The neighborhood children who used to play freely in the streets until sunset now had to go inside earlier. Their parents worried about the strangers who hung around the bar, many of whom didn't look friendly. Mrs. Johnson from across the street stopped letting her grandkids visit because of all the traffic from the motorcycles. One morning, as Frank made his usual walk to Betty's diner, he noticed empty beer bottles scattered on the sidewalk. This had never happened before. He carefully picked them up, not wanting any children to get hurt, and put them in a nearby trash can. His hands shook slightly, not from age, but from disappointment at seeing his beloved neighborhood changing. At Betty's diner, the conversation had changed too. Instead of the usual friendly chatter about family and local news, people now talked about the problems the bar was bringing. Sarah, the young waitress, told Frank she didn't feel safe walking home from her late shift anymore. Betty herself said her evening business had dropped because regular customers were scared to come out at night. Frank noticed other changes too. The small grocery store on the corner started closing earlier. The owner, Mr. Chen, said some bikers had been harassing his teenage daughter who helped at the store. The local park where Frank often sat to feed the birds was now often empty, except for groups of leather-clad men who would gather there, speaking loudly and leaving their trash behind. Even Frank's beloved garden started showing signs of trouble. One morning, he found motorcycle tire tracks across his lawn, barely missing Martha's prized rose bushes. Another day, he discovered cigarette butts thrown into his flower beds. Each time, Frank would quietly clean up the mess, but his heart grew heavier. The local police seemed overwhelmed. When neighbors called to complain about the noise or suspicious activities, they would come, but usually long after the trouble had passed. Officer Reynolds, who had known Frank for years, admitted they were short-staffed and couldn't be everywhere at once. The final straw came when Frank was sitting on his porch one afternoon. A group of bikers stopped their motorcycles right in front of his house. They were young men with leather jackets and tattoos covering their arms. One of them looked straight at Frank and revved his engine so loud it made the old veteran's windows rattle. Frank didn't move from his chair. He sat straight, just as he had been trained in the military, and looked back at them calmly. The biker seemed annoyed that Frank wasn't scared. He revved his engine again, even louder this time, and shouted something to his friends that made them all laugh. As they finally rode away, Frank remained in his chair, but his mind was already working. He remembered his old surgeon's words from the war. Sometimes the biggest battles start small, and are not always won with guns. Frank knew he needed to do something, not just for himself, but for his whole neighborhood. That night, as Frank lay in bed listening to the distant noise from the bar, he made a decision. He might be old, but he wasn't helpless. Tomorrow, he would start fighting back, not with violence, but with the same careful planning and strategy that had kept him alive during the war. The next morning started like any other, with Frank making his way to Betty's diner, but today was different. As he walked slowly with his cane, he heard the now familiar sound of motorcycles approaching from behind. Instead of passing by quickly like they usually did, 3 bikes slowed down and rode alongside him. "Hey, old-timer," one of the bikers called out. "You're the guy from that house with all the flowers, aren't you?" His voice wasn't friendly. The other bikers laughed, circling their motorcycles around Frank like sharks. Frank kept walking, his grip tightening on his cane. He'd faced worse in the war, much worse. These young men didn't scare him, but he knew he had to be careful. His body wasn't as strong as his spirit anymore. "What's wrong, Grandpa? Too good to talk to us?" Another biker taunted, revving his engine. The noise was loud enough to make Frank's ears ring, bringing back memories of explosions from long ago. But Frank didn't flinch. He just kept walking, one steady step at a time. When he finally reached Betty's diner, the bikers roared away, their laughter echoing down the street. Inside, Betty rushed to Frank's side. "I saw what happened," she said, worry clear in her voice. "Should we call the police?" Frank shook his head. "Not yet," he said quietly. "They're just trying to scare me. But I've seen real fear, Betty. This isn't it." Still, he noticed his hands trembling slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. The harassment continued over the next few days. Every time Frank went for his walk, the bikers would appear. Sometimes they would just rev their engines and shout. Other times, they would ride very close to him, pretending they might hit him before swerving away at the last second. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. People started offering Frank rides, but he politely refused. "The day I let bullies change how I live my life is the day I stop being who I am," he told them. One afternoon, while Frank was tending to his garden, 5 motorcycles parked right in front of his house. The bikers were bigger and rougher looking than the ones who usually bothered him. Their leader, a tall man with a skull tattooed on his neck, walked right up to Frank's fence. "So you're the tough guy we've been hearing about," the man said, his voice rough. "The one who thinks he's too good to show some respect to his new neighbors." Frank straightened up from his flowers, holding his garden trowel. Despite his age, he stood tall, looking directly at the biker. "Respect," Frank said calmly, "is earned, not demanded. Something I learned a long time ago." The biker's face turned red with anger. He kicked Frank's mailbox, leaving a big dent. "You know what I learned, old man? I learned that smart people know when to be scared." Just then, Mrs. Johnson came out of her house across the street. She had her phone in her hand, clearly recording everything. Other neighbors appeared on their porches too, watching silently. The biker looked around. noticing all the witnesses. "This isn't over," he growled, walking back to his motorcycle. As the group roared away, they deliberately rode over the edge of Frank's lawn, leaving deep tire tracks in the grass. That evening, Frank sat at his kitchen table, looking at old photographs from his war days. One showed him with his unit, all of them young and brave, ready to face any danger. Another was of him receiving a medal for bravery under fire. He hadn't been afraid then, and he wasn't afraid now. But he was worried. Not for himself. He had lived a long, good life. He was worried about his neighbors, especially the children who used to play freely in the streets. He was worried about Sarah from the diner, who was scared to walk home alone. He was worried about Mr. Chen's daughter at the grocery store. Frank knew that tomorrow would bring more harassment. The bikers would try harder to frighten him, thinking his age made him an easy target, but they didn't know what kind of man they were dealing with. Frank Thompson hadn't survived a war and lived 93 years by backing down from bullies. As he got ready for bed that night, Frank began forming a plan. These bikers thought they were dealing with a weak old man. Soon they would learn just how wrong they were. Frank started keeping a small notebook in his pocket. In it, he wrote down everything: motorcycle license plate numbers, descriptions of the bikers, times of incidents, and what exactly happened. His military training had taught him the value of good intelligence, and his hands might be old, but they could still write clearly. One morning, as Frank checked his mailbox, he found a crumpled piece of paper inside. It was a crude drawing of a skull with the words, "Last Warning," written below it. Instead of throwing it away, Frank carefully placed it in a plastic bag, just like he'd seen police officers do on TV shows. He added it to his growing collection of evidence. The neighborhood had become unusually quiet. Children no longer played outside, and many of Frank's neighbors had started avoiding their usual routines. Even the morning regulars at Betty's diner had dwindled to just a handful of people. The bikers had succeeded in scaring almost everyone away. But they hadn't scared Frank. Every morning, he still made his walk to the diner, despite the bikers' harassment. Every afternoon, he still tended his garden, even though they would drive by and shout insults. And every evening, he still sat on his porch, watching and writing in his notebook. Officer Reynolds stopped by one afternoon while Frank was in his garden. "We've received your reports, Frank," he said, looking uncomfortable. "But without direct evidence of crimes, there's not much we can do. These guys are careful. They know exactly how far they can go without breaking any major laws." Frank nodded, understanding the situation. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "you have to let the enemy think they're winning before you can beat them." Officer Reynolds didn't understand what Frank meant, but he noticed the old veteran's eyes had a determined look that reminded him of his own grandfather, who had also fought in World War II. That evening, the harassment got worse. A group of bikers parked across the street from Frank's house, playing loud music and drinking beer. When Frank came out to water his garden, they threw their empty cans onto his lawn. One can hit his cherished rose bush, breaking several stems. "What are you going to do about it, old man?" one of them shouted. "Going to write it down in your little notebook?" They had noticed Frank's habit of taking notes, and it had become another thing they mocked. Frank said nothing. He simply picked up the cans, one by. The morning sun was just rising when Frank stepped onto his porch and froze. His heart seemed to stop for a moment. The American flag that had flown in front of his house for decades, the same flag he'd received at his wife Martha's funeral to honor her work with veterans, lay crumpled in the dirt, torn to pieces. But that wasn't the worst of it. Frank's legs shook as he made his way to the garden. Martha's rose garden, which he had tenderly cared for since her passing, was completely destroyed. The roses were ripped from the ground, scattered across the lawn. Motorcycle tracks crisscrossed the flower beds, crushing everything in their path. Frank slowly lowered himself onto the ground next to the ruined roses, his old knees protesting. With trembling hands, he picked up one of the broken flowers. For the first time since the bikers had arrived in the neighborhood, tears filled his eyes. These roses were his last living connection to Martha. Mrs. Johnson came running across the street in her mourning robe. "Oh, Frank," she gasped when she saw the destruction. "I'll call the police right away." But Frank barely heard her. His mind was far away, remembering something his commanding officer had told him during the war. "There's a moment, Sergeant Thompson, when you have to decide if you're going to let evil win. That's the moment that defines a man." As Frank sat there among the ruins of his garden, something changed inside him. The sadness in his eyes was replaced by a fierce light that hadn't been there for many years. His hand stopped shaking. His back straightened, despite his age. Officer Reynolds arrived quickly this time, looking genuinely angry when he saw the damage. "This is too far," he said, taking photographs of the destruction. "This is vandalism and destruction of property. We can act on this." But Frank slowly shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "Not yet." The officer looked confused. "But Frank, we finally have clear evidence. We can." "I said not yet," Frank repeated, his voice firmer now. He stood up carefully, brushing dirt from his pants. "Sometimes you need to let the enemy show their whole hand before you play yours." Throughout the day, neighbors came by to offer help and sympathy. Mr. Chen brought cleaning supplies. Sarah from the diner came with fresh coffee and sandwiches. Even some of the local kids showed up with their parents, wanting to help replant the garden. But Frank thanked them all and sent them away. "It's not time for cleaning up yet," he told them. "This garden has one more job to do." That evening, Frank sat at his kitchen table with his notebook open, but he wasn't writing new observations. Instead, he was reading through everything he'd recorded over the past weeks. License plate numbers, names, patterns of behavior, times and dates. His military training in intelligence gathering had taught him that every piece of information could be important. As night fell, Frank heard the familiar sound of motorcycles approaching. The bikers had come to admire their handiwork. Through his window, you could see them pointing and laughing at the destroyed garden and the torn flag. "That ought to teach the old man to mind his own business," one of them shouted. Frank watched them silently. In the dim street light, he could see the skull tattoo on the neck of their leader. The same man who had threatened him days earlier. The same man whose motorcycle license plate Frank had carefully recorded in his notebook. After they rode away, Frank went to his closet and pulled out an old military footlocker he hadn't opened in years. Inside, under his uniform and medals, was a small leather case. He opened it slowly, revealing several photographs of himself in uniform, standing with important-looking men. "Time to call in some old favors," he whispered to himself. Before going to bed that night, Frank stood at his window, looking out at his ruined garden. Most people would see only destruction, but Frank saw something different. He saw a turning point. The bikers thought they had broken his spirit, but instead, they had awakened something that had been sleeping for a long time, the soldier within. Tomorrow, Frank decided, the real battle would begin. Early the next morning, Frank made some phone calls. The first was to his old friend Charlie, who had served with him in military intelligence during the war. Charlie now worked as a private investigator in the city. The second call was to his grandson Tommy, who worked with computers for a big company. "I need some information," Frank told them both. "And I need it fast." While he waited for their help, Frank did something unusual. He didn't go to Betty's diner. Instead, he sat quietly in his house, watching the biker bar through his bedroom window with his old military binoculars. He noticed things he hadn't seen before. Every Thursday morning, a large truck would arrive at the bar. The bikers would quickly unload wooden crates and take them inside through the back door. They were always very careful with these crates, and they always kept lookouts posted while unloading. Frank wrote everything down in his notebook. He noticed that the skull-tattooed leader was always present for these deliveries. He also noticed that some of the boxes had strange markings on them, markings that reminded him of code symbols he had seen during the war. Around noon, his grandson Tommy called back. "Grandpa," Tommy said, his voice excited, "I did some digging online like you asked. These guys aren't just regular bikers. Their leader, the one with the skull tattoo. His name is Jake the Snake Morrison. He's wanted in 3 states for running illegal operations." Frank wasn't surprised. He had suspected something like this. "What kind of illegal operations?" he asked, writing the name in his notebook. "Mostly stolen merchandise," Tommy explained. "But there might be worse stuff too. The FBI has been trying to catch him for months, but they can never prove anything." An hour later, Charlie called with more information. "Frank, those license plate numbers you gave me, 4 of those bikes were reported stolen in different states. And that bar? It's registered to a company that's been investigated for money laundering." Frank sat at his kitchen table, looking at all the pieces of information. Like a puzzle, they were starting to form a clear picture. The bar wasn't just a hangout for troublemakers, it was a front for something much bigger and more dangerous. He remembered something else he had noticed. Every Friday night, expensive cars would park behind the bar. Men in suits would go inside and leave after just a few minutes. Frank had written down their license plate numbers too. Using his old military training, Frank started connecting the dots. The weekly deliveries, the secret meetings, the stolen bikes, the money laundering, it all pointed to one thing. These weren't just bullies causing trouble in the neighborhood. They were criminals using the bar to hide their real business. That afternoon, Frank heard motorcycles outside. Looking through his window, he saw 3 bikers taking pictures of his house with their phones. They were trying to scare him again, but now Frank smiled. They had no idea that they were giving him exactly what he needed, proof that they were watching him. Frank opened his footlocker again and took out an old photograph. It showed him with a group of important-looking men in suits, taken right after the war. One of those men was now a high-ranking FBI official. Frank had saved his life during a secret mission in the war, and the man had told Frank, "If you ever need anything, just call." For years, Frank had never used that favor, but now, looking at his ruined garden through the window, he knew it was time. These criminals had made 3 big mistakes. First, they had chosen his neighborhood for their operation. Second, they had underestimated an old veteran. And third, they had destroyed Martha's roses. As the sun set, Frank made one final phone call to a number he had kept safe for over 50 years. When someone answered, Frank spoke clearly and confidently. "This is Technical Sergeant Frank Thompson. I need to speak with Director Wilson about a matter of national security." The pieces were all in place now. Frank put down the phone and smiled again. Tomorrow would be a very interesting day at the Iron Horse Bar. Friday morning arrived with unusual quietness. Frank sat on his porch, drinking his coffee, looking as if it was just another normal day. The bikers rode past his house several times, revving their engines and laughing. Frank simply waved at them, which seemed to make them angry and confused. What the bikers didn't know was that Frank's phone call the night before had set big things in motion. Director Wilson hadn't forgotten the debt he owed to the old veteran. Within hours of Frank's call, FBI agents were quietly setting up positions around the neighborhood. Frank checked his watch. It was almost time for the regular Thursday delivery truck to arrive at the bar. Right on schedule, the large truck appeared, with Jake the Snake Morrison and his men quickly starting to unload their mysterious crates. But today was different. As the bikers carried the crates inside, unmarked cars quietly pulled into position around the bar. FBI agents disguised as construction workers set up their equipment in a nearby vacant house. Everything was happening exactly as Frank had planned. Around noon, Frank did something unexpected. He walked right into the Iron Horse Bar. The bikers inside fell silent, staring at the old man who dared to enter their territory. Jake Morrison stepped forward, his skull tattoo seeming to glow in the dim light. Well, Jake sneered. "Look who finally decided to pay us a visit. Come to beg us to leave you alone, old man." Frank stood tall, leaning on his cane. "No," he said calmly. "I came to give you a chance to surrender." The bar erupted in laughter. Jake walked closer to Frank, trying to look threatening. "Surrender? To who? You and your little notebook." Frank smiled slightly. "No. To them." He pointed to the window. Suddenly, sirens blared outside. FBI vehicles screeched to a halt around the bar. Dozens of agents in tactical gear burst through every door and window. At the same time, a large group of motorcycles roared up. But these weren't Jake's men. They were the Veteran Motorcycle Club, friends Frank had called the day before. Jake tried to run for the back door, but found it blocked by armed agents. His men threw up their hands in surrender as the FBI quickly took control of the bar. Agents opened the mysterious crates, revealing stolen goods, illegal weapons, and evidence of other crimes. Director Wilson himself walked into the bar, going straight to Frank. "Just like in 45, he said, shaking Frank's hand. "You did the intelligence work, and we handled the raid. Some things never change, eh, Sergeant Thompson?" Outside, neighbors came out of their houses, watching in amazement as the FBI led Jake and his gang away in handcuffs. The Veteran Motorcycle Club members, many of them wearing their own military medals, formed a protective circle around Frank. Sarah from the diner brought coffee for everyone. Mrs. Johnson was taking pictures with her phone. Mr. Chen and his daughter handed out cold drinks to the FBI agents. Even Officer Reynolds was there, looking both impressed and a little embarrassed that he hadn't realized what was really happening at the bar. One of the veteran bikers, a tall man with gray hair, approached Frank. "We're sorry we didn't come sooner," he said. "When we heard one of our own was being harassed, especially a World War II vet, we had to help. The bar is going to need new owners now. We're thinking of buying it, making it a proper place for veterans and families." Frank looked around at his neighborhood. Children were coming out to play again. People were smiling and talking in the streets. The fear that had haunted everyone for weeks was gone. Later that evening, as things quieted down, Frank sat in his garden. The veteran motorcycle club members had spent hours helping him replant Martha's roses. They promised to come back every week to help maintain the garden. A new American flag flew proudly in front of his house, a gift from Director Wilson himself. As the sun set, Frank heard motorcycles again, but this time they were friendly sounds. The veteran bikers had promised to patrol the neighborhood regularly, keeping it safe. Frank wrote one final entry in his notebook: "Mission accomplished." Then he closed it and smiled. Sometimes the best victories weren't won with strength or weapons, but with patience, intelligence, and help from old friends. 1 month had passed since the dramatic raid on the Iron Horse Bar. The neighborhood had changed so much that it seemed like the troubled times had been just a bad dream. The old warehouse that once housed the illegal operation was now transformed into Veterans Corner, a family-friendly restaurant and meeting place run by the Veteran Motorcycle Club. Frank sat in his usual spot on the porch, but he wasn't alone anymore. Every morning, different members of the club would stop by to share coffee and stories with him. Today, it was Mike, a Vietnam veteran who loved hearing Frank's World War II tales. "You know what amazes me most about your plan, Frank?" Mike said, sipping his coffee. "You never used violence. You fought them with your mind, just like in your intelligence days." Frank smiled, looking at his garden. The roses were growing strong again, and new flowers had been added. The Veteran Motorcycle Club had helped him create a special section dedicated to fallen soldiers, with red, white, and blue flowers arranged like an American flag. Betty's diner was buzzing with activity again. Sarah had not only kept her job but had been promoted to manager. She had started a special discount for veterans, and the place had become a popular spot for both old and young service members to gather. The neighborhood children were back on the streets, playing freely, but now they had new guardians, the veteran bikers who regularly patrolled the area on their motorcycles. Instead of being scary, these bikers would stop to help kids with their bikes or teach them about motorcycle safety. Mr. Chen's grocery store was doing better than ever. The veteran bikers made sure to buy their supplies there, and they had helped him set up a special delivery service for elderly neighbors who couldn't walk to the store easily. One sunny afternoon, Officer Reynolds visited Frank with some news. "Jake, the Snake Morrison and his gang will be in prison for a long time," he said. "The FBI found connections to criminal operations in 12 states. You didn't just save our neighborhood, Frank. You helped bring down an entire criminal network." Frank nodded quietly. He was more interested in the positive changes in his community. The Veterans Corner had started hosting weekly dinners where old soldiers could share their stories with young people. They had also created a scholarship fund for local students interested in military service or law enforcement. Mrs. Johnson had started a community garden next to Frank's, inspired by how the neighborhood had come together. Every Saturday, people would gather to plant flowers and vegetables, with Frank giving gardening advice from his chair. The most remarkable change was how the neighborhood had become closer than ever. People didn't just know each other now, they looked out for each other. If someone needed help, others would step in without being asked. The spirit of service that Frank had known in the military had spread throughout the community. On Frank's 94th birthday, the whole neighborhood threw him a surprise party in Veterans Corner. The walls of the restaurant were decorated with American flags, and Martha's favorite roses were on every table. Even Director Wilson came, bringing with him a special commendation from the FBI for Frank's role in the investigation. But the best gift came from the Veteran Motorcycle Club. They had created a special garden monument in front of Veterans Corner with a plaque that read, "Dedicated to Technical Sergeant Frank Thompson, a man who proved that courage knows no age." As Frank looked around at the happy faces of his neighbors, the proud veterans, and the plain children, he thought about how sometimes the worst situations could bring out the best in people. The bikers who had meant to destroy their neighborhood had instead made it stronger. That evening, as Frank sat on his porch watching the sunset, he heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles. But now it was a comforting sound, the sound of friends patrolling the streets, keeping everyone safe. He picked up his old notebook, which he still kept nearby, and wrote one last entry. Martha would be proud. Our garden isn't just growing flowers anymore, it's growing community. Then he closed the notebook, knowing he wouldn't need it again. The neighborhood had found its peace, and Frank Thompson had fought his last battle, and won it without firing a single shot.